So we left off with Leibniz. Critique of Leibniz. On the one hand, Leibniz is to be praised for his attempt to restore Aristotelian philosophy. Much of what he says does retain scholastic principles. Nonetheless, there are some very dangerous errors in his philosophy. First, his optimistic theory essentially denies divine omnipotence. His pre-established harmony has no basis or evidence or foundation. His system of monads leads to determinism and fatalism. For he opens the door to evolutionism. In this system of the monads, he says that the distance from one monad to the next is infinitely small, so that there is no appreciable transition. This means that he would define rest as an infinitely small movement and darkness as infinitely small light. This means that the specific difference between beings is erased. This is to permit evolutionism to get a foot in the door. His theory concerning the human soul confirms this. The human soul pre-exists as a sensitive soul. Then it becomes rational when it is united to a body. But if the sensitive can become the rational, you have evolutionism. As you have a transition from a lower being to a higher being without a sufficient reason. That's evolutionism. There would be in such a case nothing to block the transformation of the mineral into the vegetable and the vegetable into the animal. 5. Leibniz's theory of monads is dynamism, which is an error. It is to assign as the principle of extension something which is not extended. It's an error known as dynamism. That the first principle of extension is energy. His theory of knowledge paves the way for Kant. Leibniz's theory of knowledge is close to Kant's. He says that there are certain ideas which are derived from the mind itself. For the example, the ideas of squareness and circularity, being, substance, unity, identity, cause, perception, reason, all of which, he says, the senses cannot give. So he says they must come from the mind. That is Immanuel Kant. So you cannot sense a square or a circle. Okay. That's Immanuel Kant. These ideas are derived from reflection and are innate. You're born with them. They are presupposed by sense knowledge. This hardly differs from Kant. The sense perceptions merely excite these things that are already implanted in your mind. That's Kant. Kant calls them the categories. Which brings us to Immanuel himself. So 1724 to 1804. It's another famous person who died in 1804. Does anyone recall? Joseph Haydn. So, just a little biographical background. He was born then. He was born in a place called Königsberg, which is East Prussia. At the time, it was East Prussia, Königsberg. It is now Kaliningrad because it was retained after the breakup of the Soviet Union. It was, should put water on these things. It was retained by Russia, what is East Prussia, and they gave it the name of Kaliningrad. It still is Russia today. The Russians always want warm water seaports. They're poor in those things. They always have been. They were always looking for them. That's probably the reason why they took over Crimea. Always look. It's a very, from the naval point of view, Russia is not well placed. So anyway, so Königsberg. Which means King's Mountain. And he was Lutheran, but he eventually became. He was very ecumenical. That rational religion, and the best thing that can happen to religions is that they all get together and form one big rational religion. That was essentially his ideas. He has an immense influence on philosophy, more than any other modern philosopher. So there are three characteristics of modern philosophy in the pre-Kantian period: rationalism, empiricism, and idealism. Rationalism is that system which enthrones human reason in such a way that whatever it cannot grasp, it considers to be untrue. It's rationalism. It is the enemy of supernatural faith. Empiricism is that system which impoverishes the power of the human intellect to abstract essences from sense knowledge, and which consequently reduces human knowledge to mere sense experiences. David Hume was the big empiricist. Idealism is that system which impoverishes the value of sense knowledge and exaggerates the powers of the intellect, with the result that the object of the mind is no longer the real thing which lies outside of the mind, but rather the mind's own productions or innate ideas or categories, as Kant will say. So your mind's object is not what is outside, it's what's inside. Kant will succeed in combining the worst aspects of all three of these errors in his vast system. So first, the speculative philosophy of Immanuel Kant. We find the principal ideas of Kant in his work, which dates from 1781, entitled Kritik der reinen Vernunft, which means critique of pure reason. That is sort of his Bible. Yes. No, it was part of Prussia. Part of Prussia. Oh, Deutsch. It was German. Yeah, that's the Hochdeutsch up there. Kant says that in man there is intelligence, that is the faculty of knowing, which he divides into sensibility, understanding, and reason. He says that philosophy must be above all critical, which is to say that it must discuss and examine the foundations and real value of its affirmations and negations. Thus, philosophy must analyze the act of knowledge itself. One must examine the cognitive faculty itself, as well as the source, the conditions, and the limits of human knowledge. So Kant's philosophy is primarily epistemological. Remember, episteme in Greek means knowledge, so it's epistemological. Epistemal. Or critical. That's why you take epistemology is in Latin critica. It means judgment, and there's how you know something and how you achieve certitude. Kant's philosophy is also called transcendental philosophy because he does not confine human knowledge merely to the domain of the senses, as the empiricists do, nor does he confine human knowledge merely to the action of the understanding, as the idealists do. Rising above both systems, he uses both sensibility and understanding for the constitution and application of knowledge. We'll see that. Kant divides philosophy into three parts: the transcendental aesthetics, which is a critique of sensibility; transcendental logic, which is a critique of the faculty of understanding; and then the transcendental dialectic, which is a critique of reason. The fundamental problem of philosophy is to recognize and establish the conditions which render human knowledge possible, he says. Kant says that human knowledge results from sensations, which he calls the matter, and of concepts and ideas, which he calls the form of knowledge, and thus also from the principles of universality and necessity, which give to human knowledge their scientific character. Sensations, concepts, and ideas do not constitute a scientific knowledge except insofar as they are formulated in judgments, because judgment is the primary function of understanding. Judgments are either analytical or synthetic. An analytical judgment is one in which the predicate is contained essentially in the very idea of the judgment. He's right about that. Example, bodies are extended. The notion of extension is contained in body. The predicate in this case merely contains the subject, explains the subject, and expresses something which is implicit in the subject. On the other hand, a synthetic judgment is one in which the predicate comes from experience, that is, where the predicate is not necessarily contained in the notion of the subject. For example, a cow is brown. The scholastics admit this distinction of judgments. But Kant adds a third possibility, and this is very important for his system, the synthetic a priori judgment. Synthetic is going to say that the predicate is not contained in the subject. That's synthetic. Yet it's a priori. That means it is before experience. So how do you get a synthetic judgment, that is something where subject and predicate do not necessarily go together? The cow is brown, which can be known only from experience. How do you get a synthetic judgment before a sensation? He needs that. And he gives these examples, which are absurd. First, 7 plus 5 equals 12. He says that's synthetic a priori. That means that 12 is not contained in the notion of 7 plus 5. Well, what else does 7 plus 5 contain? I mean, that is an unforgivable mistake for a man who's claiming to be the ultimate philosopher. I mean, a first grader could figure that out. Next, everything which happens has a cause. See, that's the idea of happening. It does not contain necessarily a cause. To happen means to come into being. Something comes into being that was not in being before. Well, how does that happen without a cause? Or does it just poof? The very notion of happening or coming into being contains the idea of cause. Yes? No, not at all. And then this is a good one too. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. The notion straight line is not contained in the notion of shortest distance between 2 points. Shortest distance between 2 points. That does not imply straight line for Immanuel. Well, then what is it? These are analytic judgments. But he says they're synthetic a priori. Here he says you have judgments which are a priori or a priori, since they do not rely on experience, but are nonetheless synthetic. That is, where the predicate actually adds something to the notion of the subject. Okay. Having said this, he concludes that the only scientific knowledge of man consists in the synthetic a priori judgment. The analytical judgment is not scientific, since it adds nothing new to the notion of the subject. The synthetic a posteriori judgment, the cow is brown, is based purely on experience, is not scientific, since it lacks universality and necessity. This being so, Kant, from this point, seeks to establish under what conditions the synthetic a priori judgment is possible. And this is the subject matter of the critique of pure reason. Now you have to remember that Kant is trying to save science, because Hume has wrecked science. He's trying to find a way in which you can have universal knowledge and necessary universal knowledge, but at the same time retain the empiricism of Hume and the empiricism in general. He's taking Hume and elevating him, so to speak. And we're going to save science. He's writing this in the 1770s, right? That's when science is really getting going in Europe. You know, the steam engine and various other inventions, or the science is becoming very popular in Europe at the time. So it needs a system that guarantees its conclusions. It's the time of hot air balloons. It's true. Well, that was a big deal in those days. Various other things that a lot of emphasis on science. The transcendental aesthetics. The function of the sense faculties is not only to furnish sensations, but also to provide an internal and active force. In other words, in every sensation, there is an a posteriori element and an a priori element which is produced in the mind. So a posteriori means something that comes from experience. A priori means something that comes from before experience. The origin of it is not experience. These two a priori elements, he says, are space and time. Space and time are the condition of internal experience. So we experience everything in space and time, but those are only internal things. Space is not something real. Time is not something real. And space and time are not experienced. They are not real and concrete, but are categories of the act of sensation. They are anterior to every act of sensation. They come before every act of sensation. They are not the perceived object. They are instrumental categories in which we receive objects. So we receive objects in space and time. That is, we understand them in space and in time. Kant alleges a proof. He says that we cannot make an abstraction of space and time. This is not true. We can define both of them. Kant's problem is that he is confusing the intellect with the imagination. The imagination cannot abstract, to be sure, but the intellect can. The imagination can only image, can only give you a picture. Or it can reproduce sounds. You can memorize a Gregorian chant melody. That's in your imagination. Sometimes it's in your imagination more than it should be. It's in your imagination more than it is in the reality. But but the intellect is what abstracts the essences of things. It understands essence. So your intellect understands the essence of time. It is the measurement of movement. Aristotle said that. Time is the measurement of movement. All of our time is based on the movements of the celestial bodies, the sun and the moon. Watches and clocks, everything is based on those regular movements. And therefore, you meet somebody at a certain time, that means when the sun is in a certain position, ultimately. And that is done by a clock, which is analogous to the movements of the sun. Or it can be done digitally, too. It's very simple. So there has to be some standard movement, some regular and standard movement. That's why you have pendulums on clocks. Standard, regular movement. That's imitating the standard, regular movement of the sun. So, this doctrine of Kant concerning space and time, that they are merely subjective categories a priori, leads logically to the subjectivity of sensible knowledge. What we perceive in our sense knowledge for Kant is not the thing in itself, in German Ding an sich, or noumenal reality, but rather things only as they appear under the internal forms or categories of space and time. Thus, things are modified by the faculty of sensibility. It is like seeing things through a prism. This subjectivism of Kant, found in the Transcendental aesthetics, will act as the basis for his whole philosophy. So, what he's saying is, well, it's probably better to get into it. So, the transcendental logic. the intelligence as a faculty which is above sensibility and distinct from it comprises understanding, in German Verstand, which is the faculty to judge, and reason, properly so called Vernunft, which is the faculty to attach certain judgments to universal ideas. The critique of reason under the first aspect is called Transcendental Analytics, and under the second aspect is called Transcendental Dialectics. So it's the process of reasoning, ratiocinium, we would say in Latin. The first part is the, you might call the logica minor. Actually, no, the dialectics. But in any case, he's distinguishing the judgment from reasoning there. That's all that means. When the sensible representations, already rendered subjective by the forms of space and time, pass into the intellectual sphere, they receive certain modes or pre-existing forms as they pass into the understanding. The sensible representations are grouped and coordinated under the pre-existing forms. From this union result pure concepts or the notions of things. These pre-existing forms are called categories. The number and qualification of these is in relation to the number and classification of the possible judgments, or the categories are merely the possible predicates of a thing. Judgments can have as their object a thing's quality, quantity, its mode of being, or its relations with other things. Thus, the four fundamental categories are quantity, quality, relation, modality. Each of these contains others. Quantity contains unity, multitude, and totality. Quality contains reality, negation, limitation. Relation contains substantiality, inherence, causality, dependence, and concurrence, simultaneity. And modality contains possibility, impossibility, being, non-being, necessity, and contingence. So that means what he's saying. His system is this, essentially. There is over here, the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. We can't know that. All right? Forget it. See, now, scholastics would say we can know this. We know essences. But the Ding an sich emits phenomena. Appearances. Sensible data. And then you have Immanuel over here. And he's got all these categories in his stupid head. All right? And Immanuel is going to organize all of this stuff coming from the Ding an sich, or the noumena. That's the other thing. It's a Greek word. Thing in itself. The essence, what we call the essence. It's going to organize it, something like, a big bag of letters in the post office, and we're going to put them in categories like this. And look at the categories. The categories are all from your head. You're not getting any of this from reality. They're all in your head. Look at them. Being, non-being, necessity, contingents, possibility, impossibility. Those are productions of your head for Kant. Innate ideas. And you add these things to your experiences. Quantity, how much? Like how much money? You say that's something that's in your head. Quality, relation, modality, unity, multitude, totality. These are all productions of your head. Do you see what this does to human knowledge? Totally destroys it. It sounds wonderful, It's all a lot of garbage. But when you read Kant, you get this impression of reading somebody who's really, 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 really deeply intelligent. He's not. I was told that Kant is so difficult to read in German that the Germans learn English in order to read him in English. It is also true that Wojtyła learned German purposely in order to read Immanuel Kant. Could you imagine wasting your time to read that garbage, to learn German, in order to read Immanuel Kant? He was thoroughly a phenomenologist. He was a phenomenologist. It's the same thing, essentially. We'll go through that. But all modern philosophy after Kant is going to be some sort of form of Kant. Some sort of modulation of Kant. In Louvain in the 1920s and 30s, Cardinal Mercier and somebody called the Maréchal. You had an attempt to reconcile Thomism with Kantianism. It's known as Transcendental Thomism. Yes. Well, that was the school. That was the school of Cardinal Mercier and Maréchal. Those are the big Van Steenbergen, not to be confused with Father Steenbergen. Runner. It's one of those. This man has had an enormous influence on thinking, because if it's all in your head, it destroys objectivity. It destroys dogma. Everything's in your head. This will be if you read St. Pius X's encyclical on modernism, this is the agnostic side of it. See, we don't know. We have no objective knowledge. Yes. Yes, and that's one of the criticisms against him. How do we know that the Ding an sich exists if existence is one of the categories of Immanuel's mind? mind. How do we know that it exists? He also says there's a causal relationship between the phenomena and the noumena. How do we know that? It's one of the big criticisms of Kant. Objective. You experience them. Objective means that the intellect is subject to something outside the mind. That it just like wax conforms to a seal. See? No, you have experiences. You know, I'm experiencing this right now. Okay? That's all you get. He says it's causal, that the Ding an sich causes the phenomena. And that's one of the big criticisms of Kant, is that doesn't make sense. If this is, behind a brick wall, then how do we know that it is the cause of the phenomena? You're trying to plug this into common sense. You have to leave common sense at the door when you walk into this classroom. All right? And then you'll be fine. If you start comparing all of this garbage to common sense, you are going to end up banging your head against the wall. So, these categories are the necessary conditions of thought and of every possible experience. So everything gets shoved into these categories. The sense experience merely serves as the matter for the judgments which we make about things, since they are transformed into concepts by these categories, these a priori forms, that means before experience, which are innate and arise from the bottom of our mind. That's Immanuel Kant. We'll stop there today.